this up? How do we tackle it? How do we intertwine those needs that young people have? I we think that it's important to look at the healthy creation of a curriculum, how to have a healthy curriculum, a healthy syllabus in place so that we can enable our students who have to have future skills to be professionals who engage in a healthy way. When schools promote this in a comprehensive way, we find that students find it easier to go through their development, but unfortunately, we find that on a daily basis, we have to face contingencies. We have to face bullying and youth and young children with depression and anxiety. It would seem that on the side of prevention, we're not getting to them in time. The system is in a status of urgency. It's like 1 to 3 years of lag. That's a prediction in learning, in student learning, 1.3 years actually, that we will not be able to give back to our students. So how can we actually be able to recognize what's essential and be able to put it at their um, reach, the reach of these children who will become adults. I think that that's very important to understand that the time that goes by and time that is lost in school is time that we take away from future adults that we expect to be a contribution to society, a contribution for the better of society. So I insist, the sense of urgency cannot be ignored. We have to be capable of reflecting on this and at the same time uh, putting in place practices that allow us to measure the impact of those practices and correcting the course when necessary, but as soon as possible on a timely basis. I would like to thank everyone for this opportunity, for actually also our guest lecturers that were able to attend for the National Council of Education. It is a privilege to have you with us today to reflect upon this subject because public policies will be the ones that will be able to enact everything that we need to do to address what we're concerned about and we expect to actually put those actions into place as soon as possible. That's why we want to tackle that point immediately. Thank you, Luz Maria. We remind you that you can ask questions in the chat application, both for our the ones who are listening to us in YouTube and the ones that are using uh, the Zoom call. So now, in this international part of the school, where are we going and how can schools actually work on welfare? This is by Danielle Hajimonji. She's a master's in clinical psychology, and Danielle is a researcher of numerous children's health, and she is senior researcher of public policies for socioeconomical, social and emotional fields. We try to work on character education and positive school environment. She has worked in interventions and she wants to develop social and emotional skills in children. She was selected as a member of the inaugural um, Hasselweisberg program in 2021. Danielle, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. So where do we go from here? I'm going to talk about how schools can cultivate well-being through social and emotional learning. Good morning. I am so honored to be here today, and thank you to the National Council of Education for inviting me to be included in this seminar. I hope that I can share information and inspiration for a future that prioritizes and invests in social and emotional learning. I am Danielle Hachimonji. I am an assistant research scientist at Nemours Children's Health in Delaware and a research assistant professor of pediatrics at Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University. And I have worked closely with the Social Emotional and Character Development Lab out of Rutgers for the last 9 years. The theme I will be coming back to over and over again today is where are we starting from? Where are we going? And how do we get there? I'll start a little bit with me. I want to share a little bit about me so that you understand why this work is so important to me. So I'm coming to you from Pennsylvania in the United States, the ancestral land of the Lenape people, just outside of Philadelphia. I grew up in the rural Midwest of the United States, and in that relatively under-resourced setting, I had many privileges in my education, and that ultimately allowed me to get a doctoral degree in psychology. Growing up, I was shaped by witnessing the educational experiences of my 3 younger siblings, particularly my younger brother, who has a developmental disability. His experiences sensitized me to the necessity of fair and inclusive educational systems. As I began my doctoral training, I discovered social and emotional learning as a concept in schools. I felt like I had made an important discovery. Now, of course, social emotional learning has been integral to good teaching as long as education has existed. But what felt revolutionary to me was the explicit naming of the social and emotional practices that support learning and inclusive schools and well-being. That is what social emotional learning means to me. I hope that after our time together today, you are able to define what social emotional learning means to you. My background affects how I do this work in social emotional learning. In my immediate social context in the United States, I am a white cisgender female, and that affords me significant privileges in my day-to-day personal and professional life. Now, on the global scale, my work is really situated squarely in the United States. So I'm not here to share or export some version of social emotional learning that we've been working on here with my partnership schools. I'm here to share ideas and inspiration and hope for a path forward that you and those you work with can shape together. So let's start by thinking about what is most important to you. So to get us started today, I would like you to reflect: what to you are the most important outcomes of education for the students you work with? There are no right or wrong answers here. And as you think about those outcomes, is there any one of those outcomes or those things that you thought of that do not require getting along with others, advocating for yourself or standing up for others, effectively communicating your own point of view, managing uncomfortable emotions, working together as a team, setting a goal, working toward a goal, dealing with setbacks or failures, or giving or receiving feedback? These are all social and emotional learning skills. So when we think about where do we go from here after the disruption from the first years of the COVID-19 pandemic, social and emotional learning is absolutely essential to any outcome we are looking for. Before we can really talk about where we're heading, we do have to really understand where we've been and where we're starting from. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because it's already been covered this morning and it's something you all know really well. We know that there have been many challenges in returning to schools in the wake of the pandemic. And in Chile in particular, I know that schools were closed longer than almost any other country. And because of the pandemic's toll in Chile, but also in other countries, there is more financial and economic insecurity, more poverty and food insecurity. and more anxiety and depression and mental health concerns, particularly in adolescents. And academically, students are behind. And Chile is not alone. Across the world, the pandemic has really been a crisis, and it has intersected with many other crises. And violence of different forms has increased across the globe. And everywhere, the already most vulnerable were the most impacted. So it's a scary time. But you all know that. But before we can think about where we are going, I think it's really important to recognize and acknowledge this significant stress we have all experienced, because we know what stress does to the brain. Stress affects social relationships, our emotional regulation skills. Stress can be helpful in small amounts. It can be motivating. But when stress gets too much, it is no longer helpful. It puts us into this fight, flight, or freeze response. We are in survival mode. We are in crisis mode. And when we feel like that, we cannot use so many of the strengths and supports that we have within us and around us. So we must acknowledge where we're starting from. We are starting from a place of exhaustion and stress. Our coworkers, our colleagues, the families, the students. To pretend that we can just resume life as before will not work. But acknowledging where we are starting from does not need to be passive or hopeless. Instead, we must see ourselves, our environment, our students, our colleagues for who they are today. Understanding what we've been through, not focusing on how things used to be or how things should be, because there's no going back. But we can push back against what stress makes us want to do. Instead of isolating ourselves or withdrawing, we can connect with each other. We can talk with our colleagues and our coworkers and our families. And most importantly, we can listen. What do you need? How can I help? And we can provide hope. We will get through this together. We can move from stress and survival to problem solving together. And what I'm describing, all of this is all social and emotional skills. We all need to use our very best social and emotional skills to work together to move forward. So what do you already know about social and emotional learning? This is the website from the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL. This is a US-based organization and really a leader in the space and the dialogue on social emotional learning. Maybe you've heard of this term, maybe you've heard of certain social emotional learning programs. Here's how CASEL defines social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. It's a process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, to manage emotions, to achieve personal and collective goals, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish and maintain supportive relationships, and to make responsible and caring decisions. These are the skills that are critical to success in school and in relationships, and in building a purposeful life that contributes to our world. And although we often highlight these competencies and these skills, social and emotional learning is more than just these skills. Social and emotional learning encompasses the conditions for building and using these skills. This means positive and sustaining and supportive relationships and communities, caring for nature, for the environment, and harmony. As humans, we learn. Learning of any kind happens in relationships. As babies, as young children, we learn to regulate our emotions and use language to communicate our needs in relationship with other adults. Our circles of caring others who support our learning includes nature, teachers, peers, the broader community. So through these skills and these caring relationships, social and emotional learning advances educational equity. Through authentic school and family community partnerships, through trusting and collaborative relationships, and rigorous and meaningful curriculum and instruction and ongoing evaluation. Social emotional learning can help address inequity and empower young people and adults to co-create thriving schools and contribute to safe, healthy, and just communities. So how is this done? There are many different frameworks for social and emotional learning, and with these different frameworks come different labels and sets of skills to focus on. I'm not really in a position to tell you which framework is going to work best for your context. I encourage you to look at this website from ESOL, which is at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. A team here has looked at dozens of different frameworks for social and emotional learning from around the world, and their mapping highlights how a wide array of frameworks for social and emotional learning tend to highlight competencies in 6 areas: in social skills, cognitive skills, emotional skills, identifying values, building a healthy identity, and understanding different perspectives. So depending on the framework, some of these areas are highlighted more than others. This is an example from OECD, and they have a learning compass that includes an emphasis on values. This actually is not even called a social emotional learning framework, but it sure sounds like one. This is the CASTLE framework, and they have 5 skills, some focused on yourself, some focused on others, and those come together in decision making. And there have been adaptations of this framework that include group level or family level awareness and skills. And some adaptations include awareness and relationships with the environment or nature. This example from UNESCO from a report on social emotional learning says that the 3 areas should be self, other, and nature as an example. So whichever framework serves as the basis, if we have attention to the process of acquiring skills and the conditions for using those skills, and if all of this is working together, social emotional learning skills and the relationships and communities where we learn and grow can help all people achieve their purpose in life and make the world a better place. You can give it a different name, but whatever you call it, it's these skills for building relationships, for coping with feelings, handling life's setbacks, and the ability to solve all kinds of problems. These are the essential skills, essential for learning and for everything we do as humans and for everything we hope to become. I invite you to define social and emotional learning for yourselves and your local communities, and to identify a framework that works for the people whose education outcomes you want to shape. We know that social and emotional learning can be a priority in schools and communities around the world. And when this happens, when social emotional learning is a priority, our schools, our teachers, our students, our communities benefit. The evidence for social and emotional learning in schools is clear. Social emotional learning can build social emotional competencies. It can foster positive and safe and caring schools. Social emotional learning supports academic achievement, and it promotes mental health. This is a meta-analysis published back in 2011. They looked at 213 programs of primary through secondary school students. and found that social and emotional learning participants showed improved social emotional competencies, attitudes, and behavior, and an 11 percentile point gain in achievement. So, yes, students gain competencies and skills, and they see gains in achievement when social and emotional learning is prioritized. And these impacts are sustained over time. Researchers followed up with students. So, after that initial program impact, in 82 different school based universal social emotional learning interventions, this is for almost 100,000 students, and 38 of these programs took place outside of the United States. Follow up could have occurred anywhere from 6 months to 18 months later, 18 years later. Social emotional learning program participants scored higher on indicators of social emotional skills and attitudes and well-being. And these benefits were similar regardless of a student's race, socioeconomic background, or school location. And how students scored on this social emotional skill development right after the program participation was the strongest predictor of well-being at follow-up. So again, students do gain social emotional skills, and these skills support well-being in the long term. So what do you think this looks like for you, for your schools, for your communities? Let's just take a moment to envision this. Imagine a classroom. It can be the classroom of your dreams. You have unlimited budget and creative freedom. You can design the space however you want. You can place this classroom anywhere. Imagine, how does it feel to be in this space? What emotions or feelings does your classroom bring out? How do you feel at the beginning of the day when you're getting ready for students to come in? And let's think about those students. What do the students say when they walk into your class? How do they feel? What physical responses do they have in their bodies when they walk into the room? How do you talk about what happens in this classroom? And how do the students talk about their time in this classroom? What do they say when they go home or when they talk to their friends? What about in 5, 10, 20 years? What do students remember from being in your classroom? Do they remember belonging, being heard, being seen, being valued? Do they remember that someone believed in them? And if they do remember being valued, being heard, and being seen, what was it that you did that made that happen? I imagine social emotional learning played a big role. I hope I have convinced you that social emotional learning is important. So, how can we actually prioritize and invest in social emotional learning in schools? First, we have to agree on a fundamental understanding of what social emotional learning is and what it is not. And I'm not just talking about the frameworks or the skills. I'm going to address some very common myths about social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is not one more thing to do. It is not an add-on. Social emotional skills are a part of everything we do as humans. There is no learning in school without social emotional learning. There is no relationship or school without social emotional learning. Students are always learning how to manage emotions, how to get along with others, from their families, teachers, and peers. But if we use the school day as a chance to teach specific, culturally responsive strategies to understand emotions and relationships, and to make our classrooms a safe and caring and inclusive place, then we can support our students in using emotions to shape their learning and relationships. Let's think about what emotion skill you are teaching a child. If you say, we already talked about this. We are not going to be sad when your mother leaves today. Versus, you look like you feel sad. What are some choices we've talked about for when we feel sad? In these situations, both children will hopefully figure out a way to get ready to learn. But that first way really denies the feeling, and that is often an unhelpful strategy for managing emotions in the long term. The other way validates the feeling and empowers the student to identify and label that feeling and make a choice for coping with that feeling. When social emotional learning is a priority, we can also consider why this child is upset. Is it developmentally typical? Did they sleep enough? Or is there an underlying stress or trauma or anxiety that leads them to be worried or scared when they're separated from their caregiver? If we don't prioritize social emotional learning, then the message is often that emotions don't belong in school. And we treat emotions as something to be managed for the sake of learning. And some kids can still learn in these circumstances, but many cannot. Social emotional learning recognizes emotions as tools to solve problems. Emotions must be harnessed, not managed. Social emotional learning is not one more thing, it underlies all of the things we do. Another myth, sometimes people think that social emotional learning is just a standalone instruction about skills. But social emotional learning is not just a program. Yes, social emotional learning should include explicit instruction of social emotional skills. These skills can be taught through a specific program, but they cannot only be taught in that program. That strategy is bound to fail. What if we taught children to read during reading class or speak during a speaking class, but then we only help them with their reading or their speaking skills during that class? Just like with reading or speaking, we have to follow up with any explicit instruction throughout other times of the school day and at home. Because social emotional learning, just like reading and speaking, is something we are constantly using. There are millions of opportunities to practice. So this is why it's important that a whole school community is involved in social emotional learning. Learning the skills, practicing the skills, reinforcing the skills in all situations, in reading, in math, in social studies, in sports, in arts, in friendships, in difficult dialogues or conversations. All teachers, all families on board with helping students practice these skills. And it's very important to remember that social emotional learning isn't just these skills. We spend so much time talking about the social emotional skills, which is why I want to highlight that social emotional learning skills are only a piece of the puzzle, because we can only bring out our best skills when we are in caring environments and caring relationships when we feel safe. This context matters very much. It's almost impossible to be your best self and use your social emotional skills when you're exhausted or hungry or afraid or experiencing discrimination. We have to think about how students and teachers get along, about how supported they feel, and how included our parents and the community. Are there any basic needs like food or housing or clothing or safety that are just barriers to learning and engaging in school? The environment or conditions for bringing out these skills matters. And one last myth I want to address is that social emotional learning is not a treatment for mental health concerns. It is foundational to all aspects of relationship health, learning, and wellness. In the wake of the pandemic, the interest in social emotional learning has grown largely because of the distress and the mental health concerns. But social emotional learning is not meant to be a treatment for mental health concerns. Having these social emotional competencies is not the same as not having no mental health symptoms. Yes, social emotional skills can be protective and make it less likely that a person will go on to have a mental health problem. But individuals with depression or anxiety or other mental health concerns need specific help or treatment. If social emotional learning is the root of the tree, then academic learning, social relationships, physical health, mental health, and wellness, these are all branches. So we know what social emotional learning is not. It is not just one more thing. It is not a binder off the shelf or just a program. Not just the skills, it's also the conditions and the environment. And it's not just the absence of mental health problems. Social emotional learning is foundational to everything we do and must be woven throughout all our environments. There is no one recipe for social emotional learning, but there are some essential ingredients. We have a good understanding based on decades of research for what is going to work best. Social emotional learning will work best when it is universal or delivered to all children, and this includes explicit instruction for skills for managing your own self and also managing relationships. It should begin in early childhood and continue throughout education and be developmentally appropriate and sequenced. The interventions should be implemented by classroom teachers and school personnel, which supports integration throughout the school day. And this means that educators need high quality training and support, and they must be supported in their own well-being and their own social emotional development. The caregivers and the broader communities must be included, and anything we're doing with social emotional skills and learning needs to be culturally and contextually responsive. And children and older youth especially are encouraged to be agents of change in shaping the world around them. Now, this doesn't happen quickly or overnight. It can take years, but this is an investment in the future. But we can't wait. The kids can't wait. This planning starts today. Form a group of advocates and champions to steer this work and set a vision. This can be at the school or city or country level. You need creative and flexible leadership. But remember, ultimately, this is everyone's journey. Social emotional learning is for everyone. You need to understand where you're starting from. So you have to listen and learn from those around you. Talk to students and families. Use surveys to collect information. How are people feeling? What do they want from the school? What do they want it to look like? And what are they willing to contribute? Learn from others who are doing this work, what has worked for them and what has not. Around the world, innovators are making strides in making social emotional learning a priority. For some inspiration, you can check out some work in Venezuela and Mexico and some other countries around the world that are highlighted by 100. This is a global organization focused on education innovations, and you can find some of these reports on their website. You can connect globally with advocates for social emotional learning through events like International SEL Day, which is coming up in March. And as you are planning, it will be very important to link social emotional learning to other priorities. This helps make sure that social emotional learning is not just one more thing. It can be connected to really any other priority that is important to everyone in the school community. Ask, how do these different goals fit together in a cohesive strategy? And for any of these goals that you want to align with social emotional learning, it's likely that some others have thought about how to do this. Take global citizenship, for example. This is one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It involves ensuring an inclusive and equitable education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. David Adams from the Urban Assembly in the United States has articulated how this might fit with social emotional learning through thinking about three questions. Who should a citizen be? What should they know? And what should they do with that knowledge? So consider, how could social emotional competencies and conditions for learning fit with answering these questions? In the planning process, if both global citizenship and social emotional learning can be cultivated together, then both of these areas are more likely to persist and become part of the fabric of the school environment. And as you are planning, implementing, and evaluating your progress, it is essential to embed explicit attention to gender, disability, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic equity. We know that the world's most vulnerable have been the most impacted by COVID, by the pandemic, and the most vulnerable have the most to gain from prioritizing social emotional learning. But we must attend to different needs and different experiences throughout this process, or we risk causing more harm. So thinking about the environments and the needs of all learners cannot be an afterthought. As we work to weave social emotional learning into the fabric of our schools and communities, we need a mindset of continuous improvement to make sure we are learning and improving all the time. This takes creative and flexible leadership and setting a vision that continues throughout the process. Listening and learning from others, aligning social emotional learning with other priorities and planning simultaneously to reach that vision, monitoring, measuring, and learning continuously, and making room for opportunities to celebrate and recognize small wins along the way, because every bit of progress is meaningful. It's really not a straightforward path. It's more like a spiraling of revisiting, where have we been, where are we going, and how are we going to get there? Returning to that purpose and that vision for the future. In summary, these are challenging times, but there is hope. If we can create a shared vision for schools where social emotional learning takes priority, then we can work together to make that vision a reality. And in schools where we prioritize using social emotional learning, we will find caring relationships and inclusive communities where students and educators can fulfill their life purpose. This will ultimately make the world a healthier, safer, and kinder place for everyone. We can harness social emotional learning to make the world healthier, safer, more just, and more peaceful. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Daniel. You truly asked a question. If you had convinced us of this need, and you're talking to an audience that's convinced of that, you reminded us that um, these emotions are not managed, but that they should be included in everything. And you reminded us something that we tend to forget, that the context must form part of the process of any educational process. And in this case, of course, is social and emotional learning, and that there's not one single formula. And if we want to work on this, we need to think of social and emotional health. So we thank you so much for your lecture. It has been highly motivating, and you're talking to a convinced audience. You're speaking to the choir, so to speak. Now we will present Dr. Carolina Iturra. She has a degree in psychology, educational psychology, and she's associate professor of the University of Talca. And her lines of research have to do with the analysis of educational practice, the interaction between students and teachers. And she is the main investigator in a project and also in a policy that's called Comunidad, driven by the Ministry of Education. Dr. Carolina Iturra, thank you so much for being with us. You may begin your lecture. Thank you so much for having me. The truth is that when we think of the need to perhaps underscore rather than to include social and emotional learning as part of our training in our educational system, it is a topic that is growingly more in need of further guidelines, not only because right now we face a situation that resulted from the pandemic, but also because this has been an important topic throughout the whole development of education. I will share with you my presentation.
I hope that you can see the presentation now. I will focus my presentation thinking on what happens in the Chilean school system now and which are the implications of highlighting the social emotional learning as a working line for the school. We have some figures. The third report of the school monitoring from the experience that's been done jointly by two universities show that in fact there is a mental health issue of these students, especially in the adolescents and youngsters. We're speaking about high school. Besides that, it is concerning to identify that there is high degree of medical leaves linked basically to the teachers and the managerial teams at schools. And that tell us about certain symptoms of the school system in regards to what has happened, or which have been the consequences of going back to face-to-face classes after 2 years of being in a lockdown. Our guest speaker, Danielle, have described a very important trajectory linked to the social competence. And this one we address somehow on the school trajectory from a boy, a girl, and adolescent. We have to understand as part of the educational process, continuous and permanent, so as to empower these emotional, social emotional skills. So basically, our own school system, the national curriculum in Chile has defined the one subject as one of the working lines for the empowering of the development of the cognitive skills, social and emotional skills of the students. And this implies somehow that there is an intention of the whole system to train the students in these skills. And they imply the skills to solve issues and problems, not only in their current life, but also as we see them in the adult life, also taking into account the context to develop attitudes in regards to tolerance and the understanding of others and about themselves. So what we would search at the end of the school trajectory, both from initial primary basic schools and secondary schools, that would be that in fact, we can have an individual that could have the capability to have a relationship with others and the capacity also to regulate his or her own emotions. And for that, they must be aware of that. So when we know how we install or how we highlight the development of these social emotional skills, we have to think on key principles. First, to understand that the impact of that must be at a global scale in the school. Not only that should be empowered or prioritized in one single specific line or class or subject, but throughout the school. And from this standpoint, we have to understand that the efforts must be done jointly. The whole school, the whole educational community must participate from the efforts in order to develop a set of actions and activities linked to the social emotional skills. These skills must have an important focus in regards to their own right. From this standpoint, when we think about how we organize a school or a educational institution, we have to think on the different layers that make up that school. One of them is the management team. The other below are the professionals that assist and are part of the main support towards certain elements of the teaching experience. We talk here about professionals that are part of school integration teams or that are part of the school coexistence, such as speech therapists or differential educators, psychologists, among others. Then below, we have the classroom context, which is an important percentage of the time that is part of the work of the schools. And we have two main players, teachers on one side and the students on the other. When we think, in fact, about the managerial teams, we can think on the steering that execute the direction of each one of them, but also all other professionals of the education. Usually they are teachers who are part of the managerial team. We speak about the heads or the counselors. Somehow, understanding also that the Chilean school system has a wide normative regulation that establish functions, duties, and guidelines that could support the relevance of this work in these social emotional skills. These managerial teams should be able to manage and highlight in the area of coexistence specific plans and actions aimed at empowering the working space for the future learning. This is part of the improvement plans of the own schools. Another actions that could be undertaken is to include working hours for the development of the staff, teaching staff, specifically for the role of the main teacher who is in charge most of the time to develop the subject of counseling, the promotion of the collaborative work among education professionals and the teachers to establish these learning communities that would allow to make a discussion on how to highlight the development of these skills throughout the school, to strengthen the activities that stem from the national curriculum, specifically in the light of counseling. Here, I would like to highlight that the subject of counseling in the national curriculum only reaches up to 12th grade, but what happened with the other grade? And to develop workshops for different students, we have to acknowledge, and as is established by the international literature and the scientific evidence, that not only these workshops should focus on the development of the social emotional skills, but also in general should highlight a series of other possibilities so that the students can and have a space so that they can increase the sense of self-regulation, self-efficacy. I'm talking about music workshops, artistic creation, sport workshops, etc. And all these actions, one of the key elements that we have to consider is that they must be systematic. It is not enough to have these workshops on a temporary basis. This must be part of the constant practice of the managerial teams, and that implies to have human and economic resources. When we think about the professionals that assist the educational work, we have to think that what they can have in their intervention activities, certain social emotional elements. It is not enough to empower or favor the specific work, for instance, with children that have special educational needs that are either temporary or permanent, but part of that work must be done also in order to empower social emotional education. And that must be part of the educational community, and that implies the participation of days of reflection on the social emotional learning. Well, we have to foster collaborative work as a comprehensive part of the work of the school, making available hours and space for that purpose. Another line, educational psychologists should design and monitor group interventions and individual interventions related to the social emotional development. It is important that Daniel also highlighted in order to establish that certain prevention actions that can be done at a group level, but the others prevention actions on a secondary and tertiary level that should be more on individual basis to support and the teachers in the knowledge and promotion of their own emotional regulation. What is that emotional regulation? Not necessarily the teachers have been trained in their initial training or continuous training in regards to these concepts and how to develop. Again, I'd like to highlight that these actions should be on a systematic basis, which needs human and economic resources. As to the teacher and his or her role, we know and the outcome in educational performance that an important part of the variance that explains the development of the student is given by the teacher. He or she is the one that stays on a daily basis with the students and who develops or is responsible for the development of the learning processes. But specifically, in the line that has to do with the social emotional learning, we must recognize that also the teacher should be able to foster and empower his or her own social emotional skills. Why? Because a teacher that has developed in an adequate level his own social emotional skills is able to deploy a positive effect and to report positive expectations towards the student. They have more resources to address challenging behaviors within the classroom. Is focused on the learning and valuing of the effort that the students do in order to solve their own educational work. It improves the organization management of the school, fostering environment that leads to learning, and they're able to model and manage frustration, self-regulation of emotions, and to be focused on the task when the student face distractions and the strategies change. So in that sense, how are we able to highlight the work and to empower the development of these social emotional skills in the teachers? Two different lines. First, formal training. And in that sense, we must include formally the social emotional skills in their own training, considering on the one side their own professional praxis of the future teacher and will have, but also empowering and considering the co and self-care of a professor should develop in their own educational communities, and that implies to empower collaborative work. These actions must be on a systematic basis that implies to have human and economic resources. Maybe one of the key questions that as a train of trainers we do in each of the school educations that these trajectories or these study plans, should they consider the years that they take, for instance? Finally, in the teachers that have been trained, one of the key elements is to be able to provide continuous education linked to teaching and professional training that includes developing training courses on concepts, but also in the practical ways of being able to develop emotional regulation, social skills, and social emotional skills in their own students, to provide training in teaching strategies on a generic level, but also specific levels in the classroom, to promote personal self-care practice and the participation of positive environment. Some strategies by the Minute of Education is the collaborative work in the professional development of the teachers, professional learning communities, class studies or case studies in the reflection meetings and feedback of their own pedagogical practices. Again, actions require to be systematic, which means to have economic and human resources.
Finally, by way of conclusion, the implementation of comprehensive school practices geared at the development of social and emotional skills require individual and collective motivation. Individual, collective, and organizational capacities and capabilities and policies that support the challenges involved in the change of practices, and always it relies on addressing the challenges once they have been addressed. Thank you so much. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Carolina, for your lecture. Once again, you propose a challenge. You pose the question of what is happening in Chile. You try to answer it. You talk of the need for guidelines. You remind us of the teacher training and the emotional and social training that they need. And there are many things that we need to discuss. Thank you so much for those insights. Next, we will have a presentation delivered by Dr. Carlos Ibáñez. He is a psychiatrist, a PhD in biomedical sciences, and he's the head of the psychiatry and academic department of neuroscience in the School of Medicine of University of Chile. And he's also um, working in the drug prevention project from Iceland. The floor is yours, Carlos. Thank you so much for having me. The truth is that it is both a pleasure and an honor for me to be presenting in this conference. And I would like to thank Luz Maria Budge and the Council, National Council of Education, for this opportunity. I must disclose that I am not an expert by any means in social and emotional learning. But I have become interested in looking at the different connections and also the underlying factors in the prevention of addiction. There are many of these aspects that are cross-cutting and the language is quite similar. Therefore, I will share with you my presentation and I will be talking about uh, aspects that have to do with the prevention of substance abuse in school aged children and youth in Chile, focusing on the role of educational communities, considering, of course, the aspects that have to do with social and emotional learning and the skills that have to do with that. So, by way of a brief introduction, I will share with you some perhaps not so fortunate uh, data. Drug use or alcohol use, drug and alcohol use in school age children. This is a survey that we do on a regular basis places us in the country in the region with the highest use of illicit substances and also legal substances such as alcohol. Here, I show you a couple of graphs where you can see that alcohol abuse or use in the eighth graders to 12th graders in the country is shown there with a trend that has been declining over the years. It continues involving a third of those students who are drinking on a regular basis. On the other hand, we see that smoking is also in decline, significant decline. That's very good news for our country. We see that the daily smoking is at 3% in 2019 before the pandemic. And also, as we can see, and we will see later on, this is directly linked to the policies put in place nationwide to try to control the harm caused by smoking, affecting young young people in general. I mentioned alcohol, and the 30% consumption in the last measured in the last survey continues being a problem. As you may see, those who were drinking in the last month, 64% of them becomes drunk. And so at least they do binge drinking, one episode at least. And just one piece of information so that we do not overload, we have information overload. These are the casualties, the deaths attributed to alcohol in different age groups in our country. As you can see, the 15 to 29 years of age there, we have the adolescents, young people. In women, 20% of death causes is attributable to death and to alcohol, and in men, 50%. This is because of violence, traffic accidents, suicide mainly. In our country, in the general population, 1 out of every 10 deaths is caused by alcohol, and it's quite high in the adolescent population. So this is extremely important, how serious it is. And other substances, as you can see here, marijuana, cocaine, and crack or cocaine, you can see there that the use of that, we have the high marijuana being the mostly used in here, 1 out of every 3 school-age children, and that was the highest in the world at that point. And this has dropped, fortunately, but only up to 26.8% in 2019. So 1 out of every 4 students has smoked marijuana in the last year, which continues being quite negative. We see the use of cocaine in 3% and crack cocaine in between 1 to 2% in the last year. So that remains quite stable over time. Some other pieces of information so you can understand better the effect of marijuana on school performance. This is information taken from a Chilean study. It involved 560 students from the 9th to the 12th grade in the sector of La Pintana, which is a very underprivileged, vulnerable sector. And it shows that the group of users reported at least using once a week, and they had begun 18 months before to use before the survey. And you can see there that in their grades, academic performance was affected over the years, clearly. This is some of the information of the very little information we have nationally that shows this kind of relationship. But internationally, there's a lot of clarity as to how the use of marijuana affects different outcomes in a person's life. Here, for instance, finishing high school, earning a degree at university, depending on marijuana, use of other illicit drugs, suicide attempts. And here we have less than once a month, more than once a month, weekly use or daily use. And these are all the drug marijuana use, marijuana smoking in students under the age of 17 who will have those outcomes that I mentioned, which will become evident after the age of 28 or 30. And this is a follow-up study of populations in Australia and New Zealand. As you can see, around 2,500, 2,600 students. What is interesting and what I would like to convey as clearly as possible is that the higher the use of marijuana, the higher the likelihood of not finish high school. So somebody who smokes on a daily basis at the age of 17 only has 37% uh, probabilities of finishing high school compared to someone who doesn't smoke, and it's 38% chances of earning a university degree, and all of those different percentages there. So you can see that marijuana smoking or use has all these negative outcomes. There's no safe consumption of marijuana in the school-aged population. The higher the education, the higher the risk, the less use, the less the risk. And this is part of the work that was done by Annalise there, that is in school aged population. They did that they did that spec study imaging of actually the addicted patients that not that they had come to a center, but actually those who were in school, and this was part of their habits. As you can see, the colors are colder, like blue and green there, and there's a decrease in perfusion of those areas in the brain. It is quite clear in international literature the effects of perfusion and connectivity and the volume of certain brain areas that are affected by marijuana consumption. And what's interesting here is that we have some information from Chile. I will leave you that link there to a TED Talk by Dr. Neubauer, who is the nuclear doctor who does this imaging work, along with the doctor who did this study in Chile. It is worth looking at. Why is it so important to prevent the substance abuse in the school-aged population? Here you can see the thickness of the cortex, of the cerebral cortex in different age groups. The bluer the color, the less enhanced the synapses in the cortex. It's actually thinner there, and the warmer the colors, that means that there's still a process of thinning of the cortex to get to its dimensions in adulthood. There's a lot of pruning going on. So here we see that trimming also. Here we see that this has to do with the area in the brain that has to do with impulsive habits and risk-taking activities. The sooner a substance uh, affects this very plastic brain, which is still under construction, the higher the possibility of addiction. So less, if there's a not so early use, then the risk is lower. This data is compared to other countries in Latin America. This is by CGAP, and they did an analysis of the reports of each of the countries that perform drug studies. And we are ranking and 9.3% there in the use of tranquilizers, which we commented at the beginning of the symposium when we were talking to the other lecturers, that 1 out of every 10 school-aged children has used tranquilizers, benzodiazepam, lorazepam, diazepam, for instance, which is very bad news. And that we rank in crack, cocaine, and marijuana, and also, of course, the harm caused by that is immense. This is data from the pandemic and the initial post-pandemic scenario. This is a study done on the implementation of the model from Iceland. This is in Colina, Lo Barnechea, and Renca, three different areas of Chile, three different communities. And there you see the number of students from schools belonging to these areas, these municipal districts that are 10th graders. The 10th graders were used to see how this was playing out in schools. Interventions, of course, it's not that they focus only on the 10th graders, but this is just to track what is happening. We have surveys performed in 2018 before the pandemic, and 2020 right in the midst of the pandemic, and in 2022 after the pandemic. The surveys, I will not drill down on them, but they talk about some protective factors and also the use of alcohol and other drugs. Here, what you can see in the graph is smoking, drinking to the point of become inebriated, and the use of marijuana. And so you can see there's a sharp decline between 2018 and 2020, and this is maintained more or less stable up to 2022. And of course, here we must take into account the role of the pandemic, and in that sense, drug use surprisingly declined as a result of the pandemic, due in most part to the fact that there were less opportunities for these young people to party and to actually go out during the lockdown period. So that was quite an interesting finding, I believe, which is important when it comes to analyzing the data to see what weight we can assign to the effectiveness of the model.
But anyway, we see a very remarkable increase of mental health problems. These are only one of the several symptoms that are surveyed here. We have data from 2018 to 2022. Sleeping problems. I felt sad. I didn't enjoy doing things. I didn't have energy. The future looked bleak, and I thought I had suicide thoughts. These are only a few ideas that, as you well said before, previous speakers, pandemic had worsened mental health conditions, reported in several studies and also in this that we confirm. Something that is not so obvious or common sense is that once the lockdown had been solved, we could have thought that the depressive or anxious system could have dropped, but that is not the case. In spite of the initial opening, we have noticed that they have continued to increase. And it's very important to bear that in mind when we think about the health systems. Now, in regards to certain questions that have to do with this seminar, you notice that we asked the students how much pandemic affected the following aspects: family relations, friends, mental and health fields, the relationship with peers, teachers, and the learning experience. In the orange part in the middle, that is the answer that worsens a lot, but it worsens a little bit. That is worsening on the left, light blue it improved, and on the right side, it didn't change. So what strike us is that the worsening of the learning experience that coincide with what Luz Maria mentioned at the beginning, and mental health. You notice that it worsened 60% almost of the surveys, and that is even more notorious in the case of women. Now, let's go to prevention. This scheme has been taken from preventive, physical health preventive strategies, which I think is quite clear as how we can understand environmental prevention. What do I mean by that? On the one side, we have the social triggering of that. Here we have a slope, or as was mentioned before, is quite relevant. Both Daniela and Carolina highlighted the relevance of the context. If we are in a poverty situation, without housing, without jobs or necessary food, we will have a slope, steep slope, so that we can deploy our full potential or skills, which is different from other cases. And we have this black ball, which are health hazards, where we can have substance abuse, and we can organize these slope with environmental measures that might influence on the access and availability of that substance. On the other hand, we could mention that social emotional skills allow to these people to face and cope with this risk and hazards. So I think it was interesting to compare these prevention modes. Now, I apologize, it's a very busy slide, but here we have the Drugs and Crimes Organization from the United Nations, and it makes a summary of the different interventions, preventive interventions for the substance abuse, and they split in a very clear fashion between different stages of the vital cycle, from prenatal, early childhood, middle childhood, early adolescence, adolescence and adulthood, and also in different levels: family, schools, community, workplace, and health sector. What is relevant here is that there are many interventions that can be done at the universal, selective, and individual basis, then have evidence of effectiveness. Each of these stars is a level of evidence that they have. And each of these colors, light blue, purple, or yellow, or orange if you wish, are selective, universal, and indicated. As you see, the school is one of the places where there are more possibilities to intervene so as to prevent. And these are skills. When it talks personal and social skills, it refers to what we have been talking today. Also, education based on these skills, social skills. So this aspect is quite relevant, the prevention of substance abuse. And as you know, it incorporates policies and culture from the different schools. Now we show a slide from the European Drug Observatory, which shows that there is a trend to report about drugs. Somehow, a focus based on information rather than intervening on the environmental part, decreasing the availability, or generating these other interventions that are useful. Talking about drugs is not useful to prevent substance abuse. Most of the programs what is relevant are the other things that I just showed, and specifically these environmental measures that have to do with increasing taxes, decrease availability, and decrease advertisement. Now, as to the Iceland model of prevention as a way of organizing protective and hazard factors, you see here that we find 4 domains: family, leisure time, school, and peers group. And in the national CNED data, which comprise several districts at a national level, you see a risk factor that is relevant to drop out of school. Another important factor is substance abuse, is a low academic performance. And many of the other risk factors have to do with domestic violence, fights, peers participating from violent acts that have to do with social emotional skills that we are addressing now. And within protective factors, we see here time that they spend with the parents, the presence of a neighborhood bonds, and that has to do with social emotional skills. And when parents do not approve drugs, in order to end the communities that care for themselves, where you see that the community, family, school, and individual factors are very similar in order to prevent not only substance abuse disorder, but also crime activities, teenage pregnancy, domestic violence. So we're not talking about specific issues in general, but rather many risk factors that are common for several issues. In order to share relevant information, SENDA, the institution, has these programs that are available in many of the schools. You participate. I think it's interesting about the Continuo Preventivo online with friendly material that also have a component based on social emotional skills. And as you will see, the development of preventing skills and others. Here, there is of course, we have to mention Skills for Life program and Kitty Foundation, where I work and use the social emotional skills in the context of cultural activities, school activities, or even scientific activities, such as a protective, caring environment based on this dynamic of learning. And the Iceland measure for prevention would end up to invite you to this activity. It says November 29th on Tuesday, where we will be reviewing this 5 years of implementation. And we will close a funny project where we address the main outcomes and recommendations of this experience. So this is the end. Substance abuse in our country is high in students with negative consequences that should be addressed. Several preventive interventions exist, and they prove to be effective. Among them, we have social emotional skills as part of them. Long-term policies are required and cross-cutting coordination to make effective these different programs, initiatives, and strategies so that they can be empowered and to accomplish outcomes that requires long-term commitments. Of course, the role of educational communities is key to prevent substance abuse and other mental health problems. Thank you for your attention.
Gracias, Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos. There are alarming figures, especially those that have to do with mortality and alcohol consumption, the Iceland model you mentioned. And it's very interesting how we could could compare between that idea, the project, and the two previous presentations in terms of understanding social and emotional skills as a key part. It's very interesting. And of course, that encourages us to continue to improve. Next, we will have rather the Q&A session. We'll try to be a conversation panel for Carlos, Carolina, and Daniel. And the idea is to answer a few questions that the audience has set in the chat. Some of them we have prepared, and some questions. So, now we will start with this panel, asking Daniel. Let's see. There is an idea that could we find an idea or an approach of interventions, a successful case in fostering social and emotional drives, and which are the main outcomes? Can we find certain evident cases that prove a successful implementation of social and emotional skills implementation? Daniel?
Yes, absolutely. There are many successful examples, really from around the world, but I can certainly share from my own experience some schools where I have worked. I have worked in some schools before the pandemic that were in difficult and stressful situations where academic performance was very low and where the students attending the school were almost all living in poverty, and just had a lot of barriers and traumatic experiences kind of in their histories. And in those environments, in our education system in the US, there was a lot of pressure to improve test scores. So that pressure felt similar to how the pressure is that we feel now from the pandemic learning loss, that these test scores are low and they're always low and they need to be better. So in these school environments, we really found that collaborating with leaders in those schools and collaborating with teachers who understood the value of social emotional learning, we sort of flipped the priorities and flipped the narrative about what made the school successful. And over a course of roughly 3 to 5 years, switched to a priority of social emotional learning and character development, and found that when we made that prioritization change, that the school climate and culture and relationships really started to shift. And so rather than a school environment kind of thinking of itself poorly because of test scores, the school started to take pride in initiatives to make the school culture and climate a more inclusive and more caring place to be for students. And the discipline of students, there were a lot of behavior problems that started to really shift. And ultimately, test scores were impacted, but it took a lot of time to get to that point. But it was the focusing on what's most important to our school and what we will really take the most pride in is making our school a caring place to be. To see that shift, it was impactful on every level, on all of these things we've talked about. But it started with really the relationships and the school climate and culture, starting with the adults and then moving to the kids and creating these caring environments. And that has ripple effects. So I think that priority is really what we are thinking about now in recovering from the pandemic, that it's these relationships that have to come first before we can really see any strides in anything else.
¿Podrías profundizar sobre el concepto de la creación de una
Could you
narrativa?
speak more to the creation of a narrative? What do you find by a narrative? Because from what you explained, that is basic to the outcomes that you mentioned.
If I'm understanding correctly, I think the question is what is the narrative, or how do you make that narrative?
Sí, y también
Yes. And also, how would you define it conceptually from a concept point of view?
I think it is the value placed on relationships, on caring, on including, and belonging, that comes first. And that's the narrative, that here in this school or in this community, we really value creating an environment where people belong, where students want to come, where students connect with educators and feel like they are valued and that they belong. And that's our very first priority, that comes first before even academics, which is a challenge and often a shift in narrative, in time, in resources to put the attention there. That's a big change. It does ultimately affect all the other outcomes we're looking for, though.
O sea, de la variable X, de la variable X,
So the success variable should be placed on the not on the academic, but to have the social and emotional actually displace that academic success and then become actually an outcome of that.
Right. And that is a big change. And that's sometimes very difficult to imagine, where the academic is not our very first priority. It is an outcome of placing the priority on our relationships and on the school climate and culture.
Hay una pregunta para Carolina.
There's a question for Carolina. As regards the counseling subject matter for teacher training, what place do you think the objectives of cross-cutting learning objectives would have in such a counseling course or class? Well, thank you so much. I think that following on the rationale in Danielle's reply, one of the elements we need to highlight and enhance are the cross-cutting objectives, the core objectives of the curriculum. And in that sense, we should include those core objectives in the whole training curriculum and all the learning and teaching processes that take place in the school, and not only focusing them on one single subject matter, such as counseling. They should be part of everything. And in that sense, we should consider, on the one hand, what are the classroom teaching hours for counseling, devoted to counseling, and what are the what is the academic time for other types of workshops that could, in addition to that, in combination with counseling, help to enhance even more the development of the context that is required to enhance, in turn, social and emotional skills. And besides having explicit modeling and teaching that we could do, we should also create the conditions so that students can express such skills. And if they can't put them into practice, how are they going to achieve regulation? How can they upgrade those skills in their relationship with others? That's a condition, that's an environment that the school must create. Beyond the obvious contexts that we saw in the presentations, what other context should be considered when it comes to developing such policies? Well, that's complex. When you think in general about what the journey of social and emotional teaching should be, we always think of the family in the first place. Historically, families have been the providers or actually the teachers of such social and emotional learning. But when we think today of the role of schools, the role of schools has displaced many times that of the family, basically because of a matter of time. Today's students spend far more time in school than the time they spend in their houses, in their homes with their families. So we have to think about how we can enhance or how we can establish networks for support, not only to integrate the family, because we have to be cautious. We can't control the integration of the family. We can provide the resources, but not control it. But we can somehow organize support networks with the different instances of help. For instance, we could develop local networks with the municipal organizations that we have. And I imagine with SENDA, which Carlos referred to in that drug prevention process, but we have to be cautious. We should not bombard the school with actions. We should actually have a decision from the school itself. They have them decide who they want to establish a network with and then help them in that process. Thank you, Carolina. Carlos, undoubtedly, to prevent, we need to detect and we need to monitor. Along those lines, having a community that is concerned with social and emotional skills perhaps facilitates the understanding of the magnitude of the problem. How can then can we make progress in that context in assessment and monitoring of mental health in young people in Chilean schools? Because sometimes the communities themselves don't know their own reality. Thank you so much for the question. And I would like to address a couple of things that Danielle and Carolina mentioned. In the first place, what happened in Iceland in the 90s was that adults agreed on the fact that it was a priority to actually take care of children and adolescents, and that it was important to create a nourishing, friendly environment favoring their development and welfare. That's what happened in a very small country such as Iceland, a wealthy country, of course, but there are other small wealthy countries that have not achieved that. And what is interesting, based on what Danielle said about the importance of the narrative, they told themselves that narrative. They believed in it. We will protect our children and youth. We will create an environment for them. That's what they said. It was key to that. Instead of saying don't not use drugs or alcohol, they said we will generate an environment that competes with drug and alcohol abuse, and we will create scenarios and contexts is to actually prevent that, maybe increase taxes and restrict advertisement, because alcohol and cigarettes, of course, are very much promoted by advertising, and the countries, for instance, that take that seriously, such as Iceland, try to restrict that. So the narrative of believing that children and young people are first required a cultural shift. And this cultural shift allowed the other environmental changes to occur. Therefore, responsibility was taken away from the adolescents and young people themselves. And the adults took on the responsibility of changing the environment and creating that environment for them. And as regards to what Carolina said, of the important things that we have learned in the process of implementing the Iceland model as a pioneer project is that leadership and the political commitment of mayors in municipalities has been essential, because many departments and many offices and many agencies within the community and the municipal district have programs that are related to children and adolescents. Programs focused on different diagnoses and different prevention measures, and focused on different types of learning, sports, culture. But at the end of the day, in general, there's this overexposure and a lack of organization of those programs. There's no coordination. It ends up being a bombardment of tens of good proposals for schools. But if there's no good coordination that is well achieved, it becomes a problem. And at least for our own local experience in the 4 municipal districts that we're working in, the municipal teams, thanks to the municipal diagnosis that allowed us to identify the risk factor and the protective factors and certain indicators that are of interest to many agencies in the departments and offices in the municipal and city hall, they were able to coordinate this better. Therefore, the political will and commitment of the local authority that makes it possible to coordinate the multiple programs and interventions that are already available in the municipal district, I think has been extremely important. Now, the current challenge is the national government, of course, because we have diagnoses made already in about 300 municipal districts in the country that are applying this survey, but there is no assurance, no guarantee for this in the future of how it will continue, of whether there will be or not some sort of harnessing of the data of all this information to improve the environments for these children. This is a decision that must be made by the current government administration, and we hope and that they will make a positive decision that somehow carries on with this work and with the experience to benefit more people in the country. Carlos, I would like for you to drill down on a concept that you mentioned in passing that has to do with the agreement on the part of the adults. Because the agreement of the adults that includes all the community, parents, all the stakeholders in the different communities, teachers, so on and so forth. That agreement among the adults, not only as regards the application of that Iceland model to prevent drug and alcohol abuse, but also in the social and emotional developments, that there is no disagreement from what adults believe and the young people get, because that causes a lot of noise. Can you drill down on that concept of that agreement that's required among adults?
That has two important dimensions. The political one, meaning that we will generating long-term plans. We're not going to do short-term plans. We're working in a cross-cutting fashion. We're not going to continue the election cycles to do that only. So we will focus on we have evidence, what is relevant, and to leave aside our political quarrels. That is key. And in Iceland, they were able to accomplish doing a political work and but at family level also, right? And that is a second level that you mentioned, yes. It is a parent level. And there's certain basic things that you can reach an agreement. And I would like to invite you to review what is called the Parents Agreement. That is an initiative that was done in Iceland, and the parents agree on basic issues of raising their kids. In parties, for instance, we're not going to have alcohol for children. We will be together with their extracurricular activities. We will try, and there are even certain things that have to do with social emotional skills directly. So parents reach an agreement regarding these basic principles, and therefore the community knows with whom they're dealing. Specifically, in the substance abuse, there is a lot of ambiguity, many mixed messages from political authorities even that are quite erratic. I smoke marijuana and it doesn't happen anything to me, people say sometimes. And it's very difficult for parents. My teenager says, well, no, marijuana doesn't do anything harm to me because this person says that they have smoked throughout their life and is a very successful person. And the advertisement of alcohol is everywhere. Now we don't see tobacco advertisement, and it's not a coincidence, as I showed you how tobacco alcohol has dropped, especially tax increase and advertisement curbing. And this set the pace. That type of agreement at the countrywide level and family level are the ones that make the difference. Thank you, Carlos. Daniel, one of the teachers that are online in this seminar. Ask a question that is regarding how and the need to develop social emotional skills in the students. We have to work, of course, but how and what's your opinion on how we do the work for the development of these skills in the teachers and the school staff? How can we work with them also, not only with the kids?
That's a great question. And I think it has certainly been a question that has increased in the context of this stress from the pandemic, but it was also a focus before the pandemic, increasing attention to needing to support teachers and educators in their social emotional skills and their well-being. And I think similar to when we talk about supporting students, time and resources and energy really speaks volumes in terms of where our priorities lie. And so if we want to prioritize teacher social emotional competencies and teachers' well-being, that means we need to set aside time and resources for those specific trainings and opportunities and listen to what teachers are saying that they need. If teachers are stressed and burnt out and they're not finding their purpose in education, like the reason they got into education, how can we support them in finding that again? And it's the context that really matters. I think if we only focus on social emotional skills, then it's sort of like blaming teachers for feeling stressed in a situation that's really stressful. So it's not always that the skills aren't there, it's that the context is actually very stressful. And so how can we even change and adjust and be creative about how to make that context less stressful? So I think it's a parallel process to what we think about when we think about students, that we need the resources and the time and the prioritization for teachers, and we need to think about context as well as the skills.
Y en ese sentido,
And
porque probablemente muchas veces el personal
probably the teaching staff, sometimes they feel overwhelmed, specifically even among those tools or instances that would allow them to work on their own social emotional development. Which has been your experience vis-a-vis that reaction from teachers that is understandable, because we are people that are about to be burned out? Have you been able to cope with that, work with them?
I think listening and validating goes a very long way to acknowledge, yes, this is incredibly overwhelming and stressful. And for most people, this would be too much to handle. So that in itself can really go a long way to listen, to hear people, where are they, how are they feeling, and then to support them from where they are. We cannot undo that stress and that situation, but we can try to figure out how to creatively move forward. So I think it's always going to start with that listening piece. I think we have really seen it be successful to even sometimes take a step back and not push a certain agenda, to just listen to what do you need, what would feel supportive right now, and see what can be done in the context. Sometimes there are a lot of constraints and it feels like nothing can be done, but there is usually something. If we can try to be creative and problem solve, can there be some professional development time used in a different way? Or can there be some teacher prep time used in a different way? Is there some way that we can alleviate some of this stress and some of this burden? But it has to start with listening.
escuchar siempre es muy
Yes,
importante.
listening is very important. There's no doubt. Carolina, based on your experience, what type of pedagogical practices foster the development of these social emotional skills? And on the contrary, which of them you could have identified that could worsen or could endanger the development of these skills? That is a difficult question. I will try to answer. So, when we think on the definition of educational pedagogical practices, we not only need to mention what the professor or the teacher does in the classroom, but also how are the collaboration spaces that are present within the school itself. Within this rationale, and also in agreement to what Danielle said, the need to highlight their own needs of the teachers, I think an important element is first to generate actions from the leadership, from the principal and the managerial schools to care for the teachers. And this is meaning generated reflection spaces, but also leisure time for them. And also to generate the feeling of community. And that feeling of community, somehow, it co-builds the belonging, the sense of belonging. I belong to this place, I'm part of this school. My discourse is important, my actions are important as well. So I think that a practice must come from the leadership and from managerial teams. Secondly, we should set also a practice that they should care for themselves. Now, of course, that means that should be provided from a support or an advice from a specialist. Let's not wait the teachers learn everything by themselves or with a spontaneous generation, this feeling of co-construction. We have to teach them, we have to model, we have to generate spaces for them. And thirdly, also we should understand that this part of the professional development and the professional skills of the teachers, and to understand that the classroom must be a protected space where the teacher himself or herself, as Carlos mentioned about adult, he is the responsible adult. He should or she generate a model which are the borders or limits that should be done to the interactions and relationship in the classroom. And part of these practices could be, for instance, something that is in the discourse of the Minister of Education, but maybe we need to embody, to stress, which is to establish a decalogue that allow us rules to all the students together with the teacher to establish which are the rules that will support us or the rights from all participants in the classrooms, because that is a collective construction that we can mention when a conflict emerges, as long that this rule has been co-built, built together, yes, as long as it has been built together. And that's only an intention to say this will be the rules that will not have any effect. We have to build them together. So these practices are necessary. And you allow that as a leading level, as a professionals, and a level that the teachers can foster in the classroom with the students. Sometimes we wonder why, if we know and if we recognize the existence that these practices are effective, they are not taken into account. I have the feeling that sometimes are the same schools that are lost inside because they don't have someone that supports them or advise them. And in that sense, it is relevant to think that the school needs from this support so that they can generate these practices in the classroom and in the institution as a whole. And do you see any risk that the same tools might become something negative, and what they end up doing is that they worsen the or do not accomplish the goal? A major risk is obligation, omissions. Yes, omission. Rather than doing something explicitly that goes against because it's difficult. Although there are certain cases, but these are sporadic cases, omission, to omit is a very dangerous practice. To omit that something mentions, to neglect that we have relationship problems, to omit that we don't have link with the families, not to say explicitly that the students are tired, not to take into account that teachers are tired. So that, in part, is a very risky practice, not to accept the reality for the collective well-being and individual well-being as well. Thank you, Carolina. Carlos, we were talking during your presentation, you mentioned how this rationale in terms of risky consumption of substance abuse and social emotional development were intertwined. So in that sense, what is the contribution from one strategy to another? Or in other words, which are the key protective factors that social emotional education provides to the idea of avoiding risky behaviors in children and adolescents? Now, if I recall the diagram that I showed of that person going through a slope with a huge ball that was coming on top of him or her, these are complementary of these approaches in the sense of the environmental approach that somehow changes the environment, physical environment, thinking on the availability, price, etc. And cultural as well, thinking on the whether we normalize the substance abuse on the one side, and also focus on the environment, and on the other hand, to strengthen social emotional skills will allow the person to decrease many risk factors that have to do with substance abuse. In that case, one of the major risk factors for substance abuse has to do with mental health issues, the impulse as a characteristics, violence, domestic violence. So somehow, interventions in the social emotional skills is across the board different diagnosis. It doesn't focus on a specific mental health issue, as was well mentioned by Danielle. It is a root that sustains many branches. And I think that therefore, this social emotional learning that is not only take place at school, but there are many other communities or relationship where also we see this learning. What it makes is to strengthen the individual vis-a-vis this situation, whether it's violence or substance abuse or schools, or skipping the schools or formal truancy, ditch the school, among one of the most important factors for consumption and school dropout that has to do with lack of attachment, lack of bond with the school. And we know that these are the children that have lost the school. It's very difficult to recover them. And there is where we have all these risky behaviors. And that clearly there is evidence that social emotional learning improves this bond of the students with the schools, and they don't ditch the school, and that will increase the development of the general life of the people beyond their specific risk behaviors.
Usually, when we take part in these discussion panels, we are usually left with ideas and concepts that maybe we would like to insist on. We have very few minutes left, so I offer to each of the panel members, beginning with Carolina, to give us a 1 minute or 1.5 minute summary of what they would probably highlight the most. I will begin with Carolina, and I will continue with Carlos, and we'll close with Daniel. 1.5 minutes for that, Daniel. Carolina, you begin, please. I think that this is a task that involves all of us, not only some of us. Without a doubt, the school and the school system play a definite role in this. Perhaps what is missing is a discussion as to how far we want to go. And then in the second place, we must understand that the approach of socio-emotional learning is not only a task involving the school. There are restrictions and limitations as to what we can do in a school setting, and to think that the students and teachers who face real issues require other types of interventions, other types of care. And finally, and to understand that the school system should at least have in place initiatives that provide care, that provide a friendly environment for different stakeholders. For instance, for the teachers and everything that that involves, teacher training, continuous teacher training, the support we provide to teachers, and the instances that allow us to do that. And on the other hand, the students, because students are supported by teachers at the end of the day. So it's important to rethink or think about how to design a system that can balance both academic performance and also the support and development of these types of skills. Thank you so much, Carolina, for your closing remarks. Carlos Ibanez, what would you say in a minute and a half? I would like to underscore the fact that to achieve changes, we need to have agreements and political, actually, agreements in the long term. I come from the world of healthcare, as I said at the beginning, and for me, I think that work between sectors is still lacking between education and healthcare, for instance. One of the difficulties and challenges lies in the fact that such integration is not strong enough. And that has to do with the fact that mental health doesn't have enough of a budget assigned to it. So I think that that overwhelms the educational system with certain activities or certain situations that should be addressed by the healthcare area. There's a budget that issue as regards prevention, not only for drug abuse, but also for different healthcare concerns. I think that that's what I would like to say, that the work among sectors and the long-term political commitment play a key role. Thank you, Carlos. Danielle, the floor is yours. We would like to hear those points that you would like to highlight.
Absolutely. And I would certainly agree with everything that Carlos and Carolina have said so far. And I think we first need to prioritize social emotional learning as the root of this tree with so many different branches that can be supported. And prioritizing really means time, energy, resources, and planning. And a part of that planning, I think, does need to be coordinating then among all these different branches: family well being, community well being, physical health, substance abuse prevention, mental health, academic learning. These are all branches that can be supported by social emotional learning, but that planning really needs to come first. And to see this as an investment in the future, to really understand that this is a long-term process and a culture shift of prioritization of social emotional learning, but then it does pay off eventually, but it is an investment of time and resources and planning that has to start now. And in terms of what we're focusing on, I would just in closing highlight that balancing of both social emotional skills and the conditions where those skills can really come out and thrive, so that all of the people in our school communities and outside of our school communities, teachers, students, families, can thrive in conditions where their skills can really be brought out to flourish.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Danielle. There was, I had some problem with the audio, but I managed to listen to everything you said. And to finish, to close, we would like to invite the Executive Secretary of CNED, Aneli Ramirez, who will be providing the closing remarks. The floor is yours. Thank you so much, Nicolas. On behalf of the National Council of Education, I would like to thank our lecturers, Dr. Daniel Hachimonji, Dr. Carlos Ibanez, and Dr. Carolina Iturra for having shared with us their experiences and reflections, which have been so interesting and so inspiring. I would also like to thank the opening remarks by the Undersecretary of Education and the chairwoman of the council, and the participation of more than 400 people in this activity. Thank you, everyone. We hope we met your expectations. For this opportunity, we wanted to reflect on the social and emotional skills and their contribution to the academic performance and development of our students. Everyone has highlighted the importance of prioritizing this and investing in that. We have reached a consensus. So how do we manage to bring everything we have discussed into fruition, to put it into practice in every area? Just as the lecturers have proposed, social and emotional learning is nothing new. The health crisis, the lockdown made it visible to us, the challenges that we cannot leave there waiting. Many of these matters have been discussed in 2020 and 2021 in seminars such as this one. So we are in a strategic time to build and to emphasize this in education. The liquidity of our times, marked by a technological explosion worldwide, beckons us uh, to educate valuable citizens for our world. And social and emotional education must be part of this. The panel members have brilliantly shown that despite how challenging and complex social and emotional learning is, it relies on prevention rather than treatment. They have said that there is hope, that changes are not immediate, but that they cannot wait. Without reflecting and organizing and coordinating this from the educational point of view to try to guide these changes, we will not be able to bring about any transformations. But to lead such change, we need to also become accountable for our challenges and our commitments. So how do we take on this responsibility? How do we guide such changes? How do we achieve those long-term commitments from the political arena? And how can we manage to understand that this is not different from other things that we need? Both the language of experts and lay people should be on the same line. We should share experiences. We should acknowledge good practices, acknowledge what has been successful and what has failed, and to highlight the importance of dialogue, and not only to talk to people who think the same way we do. Dialogue leads to improving techniques and legitimizing decisions, but also they lead to putting an end to polarization of views. To move towards shared vision, we need to be open to what is new, to be willing to leave behind our own biases, especially those promoted by those who are defending their own position instead of thinking of the common interest. So in this sense, we beckon everyone to find innovative ways that can allow us to improve our capabilities of adapting as a persons, as a system, as a country. And finally, and perhaps what's most important is collaboration and accountability. Becoming responsible for this education is an activity that is cooperative, that requires solidarity, that becomes stronger and creates more welfare when it is shared. We all benefit from learning. And that's why we are all responsible for making that learning effective. Today, we learned about the need of having a shared vision of social and emotional learning, the relevance of a creative and flexible leadership, because contexts change, but they don't all change in the same direction or at the same speed. To plan and lead such changes, we need to listen to each other. and learn from each other. We need to align social and emotional learning with other priorities, such as the recovery of learning, social relations, mental health, and the welfare of our students, as well as the monitoring and assessment of anything that we do, making the adjustments that are necessary. I think that it's necessary once again for all the stakeholders to reflect deeply on our commitments. Educational transformation requires the involvement of all stakeholders built on conditions that are profound, that guide action, and not merely on just an agreement on the discourse. We need to be aware of the challenges. We need to have an action plan in place. We need to reflect on what we are contributing in each one of these sectors by our decisions. That means that we need to review the way we enable those changes. On behalf of the Council, I once again thank our guest lecturers. Thank you, Nicolas, and I would like to thank the audience and everyone who's made this possible. Thank you once again.